Hey everyone, time for another video. On the 25th of June 2008, AMD revealed the HD40-800 series based on the RV770 GPU for the high-end market. Graphics cards using the RV770 GPU included the HD40-830, 40-850, 40-860 and 40-870. Today though, I'm taking a look at the HD40-850, which comes with 512MB of GDDR3 memory on a 256-bit wide bus. It differs from the 40-870, which has GDDR5 instead, which offers twice the bandwidth clock for clock compared to GDDR3. The HD40-850, with a TDP of 110 watts, is based on the terascale architecture. It features 956 million transistors, built on the 55nm fabrication process, and has 10 compute units, 800 shader units, 40 texture mapping units, and 16 raster operations pipelines. It has a core clock of 625 MHz and a memory speed of 993 MHz, which is effectively 1986 MHz with it being GDDR3. It supports DirectX 10.1, OpenGL 3.3 and OpenCL 1.1, and it also requires one 6-pin PCIe power connector. Monitor output-wise, it has two DVI connectors and one S-Video output as well. Originally, the 40-850 was launched at a price of around $199 US, which adjusting for inflation would be around $233 today, which would be roughly £182 or €205. But here in the UK, however, you can now buy it for as little as £10 on CEX, or for around $15 to $20 on eBay in America. One thing to note though is that you won't get the cooler I have on this card, as it is an aftermarket cooler, and it came with the card when I bought it second hand. I'll also be running all of today's games at both 1080p and 720p at stock speeds and with an overclock with the Catalyst 13.4 beta drivers from AMD. The rest of the system I'll be using today with the HD40-850 features a Core i7 6700K at 4.8 GHz with a 2-core boost of 4.9 GHz to eliminate any possible bottlenecks, 16GB of Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 RAM at 2800 MHz, a MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. So let's get on with the test. To kick off the test today is Grand Theft Auto 5. GTA 5 is the fifth main installment in the Grand Theft Auto series that had its original release in 2013, but it wasn't released on PC until 2015. 1080p was basically a no-go for the 40-850, and 720p was kind of better but still not particularly playable. 1080p's problems, I think, were mainly due to the card running out of memory, as it only has 512MB and the game is wanting to use around 1GB of memory. I had issues with the memory limit at 720p as well, but not to the same extent as 1080p. Throughout the city, FPS at 1080p dropped to the low 10s and peaked around 30 frames per second, but suffered from some fairly substantial stutter and input locking as well. There were also some pretty major lockups too, the worst of which lasted over 10 seconds. 720p on the other hand managed around the high 20s up to the high 30s, but also suffered from some noticeable micro stutter. There was however no input lag or input locking that I saw, and it didn't really seem to be an issue with the game locking up either. Out in the desert area, near to where Trevor lives, 1080p could only really manage around the low to high 20s with micro stutter throughout, whereas 720p managed to get into the mid 30s, with FPS getting up to the high 40s, and on occasion it even reached into the 50s. There was however still some micro stutter throughout the desert area here, as there was throughout the whole game at both resolutions. 1080p managed an average of 29 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 15 and 10 frames per second respectively, with 720p managing 45, 20 and 15 frames per second, for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, showing a significant improvement over 1080p in terms of average frame rates, but with stutter that isn't that much better. Moving on to our next game for the test today, and it's Skyrim, or more specifically, the original version of Skyrim, which released in 2011, instead of the newer, remastered version of the game, which released in 2016. This was a game I was expecting to perform really well, and I was right. So well in fact, that I managed to run the game at 1080p and 720p with the high graphics preset, with no MSAA and depth of field disabled through the game's INI file. At 1080p, I did notice some very occasional lockups that fortunately didn't interfere with the gameplay at all, with 720p showing no such issue. The lockups at 1080p, I think, were again caused by the card running out of memory. On the walk into Riverwood, near the start of the game, FPS manages to get into the 50s at 1080p, with 720p having the game sitting on its 60 FPS limit for the vast majority of the time. Heading indoors has the FPS at 1080p dropped down into the 40s, but fortunately there's no stutter here that I noticed. Again, 720p has the game constantly at a 60 FPS limit. Heading into the temple at Bleak Falls Barrow had 1080p stick around the low 40s up to the high 50s FPS wise, and on occasion I also saw 60 FPS as well. There was no such dip in FPS at 720p though, as throughout the temple, FPS stuck bang on the 60 FPS limit yet again with no issues whatsoever. 1080p managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 53, 30 and 21 frames per second respectively. The 0.1% low represents a stutter you may have seen during the gameplay. 720p on the other hand managed 60, 32 and 30 frames per second for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. And having a look at the frame times for 720p does however show some stutter, with a few gaps between frames of around 100 milliseconds, which fortunately didn't happen often enough to be noticeable during the test. Next up is on to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or Csgo as it's more commonly known, and much like Skyrim, I was fully expecting the game to perform quite well on the HD 4850, and perform well it did. Even at 1080p, I managed to run the game using the highest settings possible, with MSAA, FXAA and motion blur turned off. I also decided to run the test in a competitive match on the Mirage map against hard difficulty bots. 1080p did show one occurrence of stutter due to the 4850's memory running out, but fortunately it showed no stutter whatsoever during the rest of the test, or at least none that I could see myself. 720p also showed some stutter near the start of the test, but like 1080p didn't show any stutter throughout the rest of it. Throughout the test, 1080p managed to sit between the high 70s up to over 100 frames per second, depending on the location of the map you're in. 720p on the other hand managed to regularly get into the 150 frames per second range, providing some extremely smooth gameplay for those with high refresh rate monitors. There isn't really much else to say about the game performance wise, as it performed to very playable levels at both resolutions and was a great experience on the HD 4850. 1080p managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 89, 56 and 44 frames per second respectively, with 720p managing 132, 87 and 72 frames per second respectively. Both resolutions however did show some dips under 30 frames per second according to the frame time graphs. This, as I said though, wasn't noticeable at all. Lastly, before I move on to overclocking the HD 4850, is Fortnite Battle Royale. Fortnite is a free-to-play game developed by Epic Games, which debuted in 2017 as an early access game, which it technically still is, and it is also still one of the most popular games out right now. I'll be running this at the lowest settings I can, apart from view distance, which I've set to epic. Despite the game's more simplistic graphics compared to others, I was expecting the performance to be really bad, as I've had numerous performance issues with other graphics cards I've tested in the past. But to my surprise, it performed a lot better than what I thought it would. That's not to say it was without its issues though. In the pre-match holding area at 1080p, the FPS managed to stay around 20 to 30 frames per second, but suffered from some stuttering, which was also true for 720p, but that managed to hit as high as 60 frames per second at points, with occasional lockups thrown in there as well. For 1080p, the 20 to 30 FPS I observed in the pre-match holding area was much the same for the performance on the battle bus, as well as when you're diving, and when you finally get onto the ground too. The FPS here was constantly under 30 frames per second, apart from when you venture indoors, where the FPS creeped up past 30 frames per second to offer some reasonably smooth gameplay. 720p on the other hand managed to get pretty close to 60 frames per second during gameplay on the ground, although it did show some stutter and lockups throughout the test, but certainly not to the point that it made the game unplayable. 1080p managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 50, 20 and 10 frames per second respectively, with 720p managing 61, 33 and 12 frames per second respectively. Definitely an improvement overall, but 720p can still suffer from some stutter or lockups that are just as bad as 1080p. One thing I will point out though is that due to the variance in where the battle bus travels over the map and where the playable area is as the game progresses, the performance can and will vary depending on where you are on the map. Overclocking wise, I barely managed to get that much more out of the core over a standard 625 MHz. Both Grand Theft Auto 5 and Csgo could only manage to get to 690 MHz before they encountered issues with stability, with a max memory clock of 1115 MHz being stable, whereas Skyrim and Fortnite were okay with 700 MHz on the core, a 12% increase, with Skyrim managing the same 1115 MHz memory speed that Grand Theft Auto 5 and Csgo were okay with. Fortnite, on the other hand, though, had issues with artifacting at anything over 1100 MHz on the memory. Unfortunately, the overclock had no positive impact on performance at all in Grand Theft Auto 5, and in fact made the performance worse in some areas. I have no idea why, but I'm pretty sure the HD 4850 was either running out of memory, or it just didn't have enough memory bandwidth to keep up with the increase in core clock. Throughout the city, FPS still couldn't get any higher than the high 20s at 1080p, whereas 720p did in fact show an improvement here, with FPS reaching into the low 50s at points, albeit with some microstutter throughout it. 1080p on the other hand showed major issues with stuttering and locking up, and exhibited the exact same problem with input lag and input locking as well as it did at stock. Fortunately though, 720p showed no such issues with input lag or locking, and both 1080p and 720p both showed some noticeable microstutter throughout the entire game, which I'm fairly certain at this point was definitely caused by the HD 4850's lack of memory compared to what Grand Theft Auto 5 was asking for. Out in the desert area, 1080p did actually manage to get into the 30s, and there was nowhere near as much stutter as there was in the more densely populated areas of the city. But as I mentioned earlier, there was still some noticeable microstutter from time to time, as there was at 720p, which managed to get into the 50s FPS-wise here as well. 1080p showed 30, 15 and 10 frames per second average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with 720p managing 49, 20 and 10 frames per second for average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Both resolutions showed gaps in frames of around or over 100 milliseconds throughout the entire game. Heading back into Skyrim, there was very little improvement over what stock managed, although to be fair, I wouldn't say that really mattered much, as the performance of stock clocks was more than good enough anyway. On the walk into Riverwood, 1080p again managed to get into the 50s FPS wise and showed pretty much no noticeable stutter at all, with 720p sticking bang on the game's hard limit of 60 frames per second the entire way into the village. 1080p did show some noticeable stutter throughout the test, which I also saw in the frame time graph as gaps between some of the frames of around 140 to 260 milliseconds at its worst. But this however happened little enough for it to not affect gameplay that much at all. 720p also showed minor stutter at points according to the frame time graph, however I didn't notice these stutters at all and had a great experience at both resolutions. 1080p showed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 57, 31 and 23 frames per second respectively, with the 0.1% lows representing the stutter I saw. 720p managed 60, 32 and 30 frames per second for its average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. So 720p is definitely the way to go if you want high details with 60 frames per second pretty much the whole way throughout the game. Csgo actually showed a pretty decent improvement, although it was already by far the best performing game of the test to date. FPS at 1080p, depending on the location, was somewhere between 80 to around 120 frames per second, although at times was far above that indoors. 720p on the other hand managed to get as high as 160 frames per second throughout the map, and even spiked to over 200 frames per second when indoors. Both resolutions again provided a really good experience with the highest detail settings, with only minor stutter according to their frame time graphs, which fortunately wasn't noticeable during the test. Much like its stock, there isn't really much to say about the game performance-wise, as it performed pretty much perfectly. 1080p showed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, of 99, 62 and 53 frames per second respectively. 720p on the other hand managed to achieve 146, 92 and 81 frames per second for its average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, which would be great for those with high refresh rate monitors, although to be honest I doubt anyone with a high refresh rate monitor is going to be using a 10-year-old graphics card. Lastly, it's back to Fortnite. The overclock only showed a minor improvement over what stock clocks managed, and as you may have noticed, the average frame rate for 720p is insanely high compared to stock at 132 frames per second. This isn't down to the performance being great though, as the amount of time you spend in the loading screens between rounds can, and in this case has massively inflated it beyond what it should be. For 1080p, FPS still sat around the 30 frames per second mark in the pre-match holding area, and at times can still stutter pretty badly, although thankfully it doesn't seem to happen too often. 720p reaches into the 50s here FPS wise, but does show some dips below 40 frames per second with some stutter thrown in there for good measure. Something I noticed while diving out the battle bus is that the game often stutters really badly but goes back to normal after a few seconds, although for some reason 1080p didn't seem to be affected as badly as 720p was. That aside, on the ground, 1080p saw FPS figures ranging from the mid-20s up to the high 30s, but suffered from occasional stutter, whereas 720p managed to get as high as the 70s. Benchmark-wise, 1080p managed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, of 53, 21 and 15 frames per second respectively, with 720p managing 36 and 12 frames per second for its 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. As I mentioned though, the 132 frames per second average figure was massively inflated by the amount of time spent in the loading screen. Overall, I found testing the HD 4050 pretty frustrating, as the first few days were spent desperately trying to get modded drivers working so I could at least use drivers that were semi-modern until I just had to give in and use the latest official beta drivers from AMD. And to add to that, I spent ages trying to figure out why Grand Theft Auto 5 was performing so much worse than it did with an overclock. That aside, it performed a lot better in Fortnite and Csgo than I was expecting. I even managed to run Csgo with the highest possible settings, minus MSAA, at 1080p, with more than playable performance, which was amazing considering I only paid a tenner for the HD 4050. Skyrim was another notable performer here as well, although I kind of expected that, as the original version is now 7 years old at this point. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and leaving a comment as well. I'd also really appreciate it if you could share this to other people who you think may enjoy it too. You could also subscribe to my channel if you like my work and would like to see more of it. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.